Good afternoon, everyone. The webinar will begin in a few minutes. May we request everyone to turn off their cameras and microphones upon joining this webinar. For our Zoom participants, we recommend using the speaker view to optimize your viewing experience. You may change your viewing settings into the speaker view by clicking the View tab on the upper right corner of your screen. Before we begin our program, we would like to inform you that we will be posting our online client satisfaction survey for today's event on the screen and chat box by the end of the session. We hope you may stay in the webinar until then so that you may answer the online form, which is required if you wish to get a certificate of participation. Your feedback would be highly appreciated as FSI remains committed to improve its quality management system. Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to today's online edition of the Mabini Dialogue series, co-organized by the Foreign Service Institute and the University of the Philippines Korea Research Center. I am Anton Miranda, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to welcome our participants joining with us in the safety of their homes through Zoom and YouTube live streaming. We wish to greet our colleagues from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Philippine Foreign Service Post, foreign embassies, government agencies, private sector, and academia. We would also like to express our gratitude to the Korea Foundation for sponsoring this event. Before we begin our program, we would like to remind our viewers on some house rules. Everyone is requested once again to turn off their cameras and microphones when not in use. You may send your questions and comments to our speakers throughout the presentation in the Zoom and YouTube chat box. Kindly introduce yourself with your affiliation when raising questions. We would also like to inform you that this webinar will be recorded. To optimize your viewing experience, we recommend our Zoom participants today to change their viewing settings into speaker view by clicking the View tab on the upper right corner of your screen. This Mabini Dialogue will discuss South Korea's enhanced international image amid the global success of Korean pop culture in the 21st century. Academics and policy practitioners describe the third Korean wave, or Hallyu 3.0, as a mainstream consumption of Korean content and brands, and the celebration of Korean culture among international Hallyu fans through social media. The Korean wave demonstrates the value of popular culture as a soft power resource, which has ushered a period of vibrant cultural exchanges and people-to-people relations that have elevated public perceptions of South Korean culture and heritage. The positive reception of Hallyu among Filipinos has also strengthened bilateral relations between the two countries, which is evidenced by pre-pandemic tourism flows and cultural exchanges and partnerships. Today, we are privileged to have our distinguished speakers and discussants who will share their invaluable insights on the significance and prospects of integrating the Korean wave into South Korea's public diplomacy framework and its implications for socio-cultural relations between the Philippines and South Korea. But before I formally introduce them, may I request everyone to briefly turn on their cameras for a quick photo opportunity. So may we request our speakers, participants, your excellencies, to briefly turn on their cameras so that we can join them in our short photo opportunity. Okay, so our ushers are ready to assist you here. Okay, okay, ready? So let's do this in three batches. Okay, so first, 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more. 1, 2, 3. And if it's okay for the last batch, can everyone do a finger heart since we're doing Korean waves? Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much to our speakers and discussants. Okay, so we will now proceed to the introduction of our speakers for today. Our first speaker is an assistant professor at Ewha Women's University and is the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Diplomacy. He has written several publications on public diplomacy, power in world politics, and Korean foreign policy. Apart from being a lecturer in numerous academic institutions, he has also worked as a consultant in public diplomacy projects led by the South Korean government. He received his master's degree and doctorate degree in international studies from Seoul National University. To deliver his presentation on the objectives, actors, and activities of South Korea's public diplomacy framework, let us all welcome Dr. Kadir Jun Ayhan. Whenever you're ready, Dr. Ayhan.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'll start sharing my slides. Actually, I don't know why you want people to turn off your cameras. It's always more motivating to see faces in their presence, but due to COVID, we are also accustomed to Zoom, but it's always better to see faces rather than, looking at a blank screen. But anyways, I'll move forward. So today I'll mainly talk about Korea's public diplomacy. I'll try to draw the picture. I won't be talking much about K-pop. Indeed, I don't want to talk too much about it because I'm sure Professor Seok-kyeong is going to do a great job talking about it after me. So mine is going to be more about public diplomacy initiatives, especially led by Minister of Foreign Affairs and Korea Foundation. So to give a definition, this is one of the very basic definitions of public diplomacy. It's core. It is an international or transnational actors, communication-based activities to understand, inform, influence, and build relationships with foreign publics to advance a country's or an actor's interests in line with its foreign policy goals. So with this definition, the public diplomacy objectives are to understand, inform, influence, and build relationships with foreign publics. So we need to have cross-boundary relations, and the ultimate goal being advancing an actor's interests in line with its foreign policy goals. What I like about this definition, which I often use in my research, is that public diplomacy is intentional, it is political, and it's linked with foreign policy goals. That's one of the reasons why I'm not going to talk too much about K-pop, which is not necessarily intentional in terms of public diplomacy. But I'll very briefly talk about it at the very end of my lecture. And public diplomacy actually began in 1940s in the United States, right after the Second World War. Its origins are actually psychological warfare, propaganda. And after, especially the Korean War, the United States decided to differentiate or to build actually first on this psychological warfare experience from the Korean War and early in the Cold War to to help with its competition against the Soviets in especially the third world countries, to find more allies, to decrease resistance to its order, or a US-centric order, to maximize compliance with it. But after some time, psychological warfare and propaganda was not helping much, so they decided to differentiate between public diplomacy and propaganda. They created United States Information Agency to do more verifiable journalistic information, especially international broadcasting, such as Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and differentiated it from CIA's operations, which are more propaganda-like, kind of like black operations. And it began in 1940s. It took more shape in 1960s. The term public diplomacy was started to be used in 1960s. And when we talk about Korea, Korea started to use public diplomacy only in 2010. So similar policies, concepts were in use, but public diplomacy per se began in 2010. And when we look at its history, we see that there was always the aspiration to have a good country image worldwide. I'm sorry for the typo, Park Chung-hee. Under Park Chung-hee and Chon Do-han especially, promoting Korea as an advanced country, or aspiring to become an advanced country, mainly first with economic development, but also to promote Korea to the world as such, through especially exchanges with other countries, people-to-people exchanges with other countries, and to some extent also cultural events, cultural diplomacy. And we saw more opening up under No Tae-woo right after the end of Cold War. And Kim Yong-sam and Kim Dae-jung administrations built on this new trend of opening up to the world, going beyond the peninsula. Again, it actually began earlier. For example, Chon Do-han administration was talking about omnidirectional diplomacy, going beyond diplomacy that's only limited to Japan and the United States, and opening up to the world and engage with other countries as well. This was more rhetoric under Chon Do-han, and it became more of a reality under No Tae-woo, who normalized relations with former Soviet countries and China, Russia, so on. And it continued to evolve under Kim Yong-sam and Kim Dae-jung, who emphasized globalization and cultural diplomacy in early 1990s. And we see this becoming more systematic under No Moo-hyun first, who created Country Image Committee under the Prime Ministry in 2002, which was later elevated to a presidential committee under Im Yong-bak. And Im Yong-bak administration was the pioneer in mainstreaming the concept first of nation branding, and to some extent country image and nation branding, and later public diplomacy. But then again, I'm not suggesting Im Yong-bak administration did the best public diplomacy, but they mainstreamed the concept. In 2010, public diplomacy was introduced as the third pillar of Korean diplomacy, the first two being political and economic diplomacy. In the words of a public diplomat who was there since the beginning, 2010, and who is currently serving as an ambassador to another country, in my interview with him, in the words of him, Korea is still new, in public diplomacy, and it is still experimenting. But one of the advantages that Korea have is that Korea introduced this public diplomacy very late, that everyone has already experimented, and there are many lessons to be learned from other countries' experiences, and Korea is learning really fast. And it's as always, it's the Bali culture. It's evolving quite fast. For example, in the early years of public diplomacy in the United States, it was the boundaries between public diplomacy and propaganda was very blurry. Only later that it became more clear that propaganda was something that didn't pay off as much. It was just another form of warfare, psychological warfare, probably helpful during the Cold War, but not so much after that. So there was more emphasis on informational campaigns, especially international broadcasting. And that's what the US moved towards. And after the after the 9/11, the United States realized that one-way public diplomacy is good, but it is also not enough. We need to do more to engage with foreign publics more interactively. So we need to have two-way exchanges. And more recently, a normative strand of public diplomacy talks about two-way, but also symmetrical exchanges. Symmetrical in the sense that you take into account not only of your interests, but also of your counterparts. And your counterparts are no longer are passive audiences, passive target audiences, but they are also active stakeholders who have a say and who co-create the outcomes of public diplomacy. So all this evolution took place in the United States from 1940s up until today. And all of these lessons are out there for South Korea to learn, and South Korea is learning them quite fast. And the history of Korean public diplomacy, as I say here, is only slightly longer than a decade. And South Korea is also going through this its own evolution of public diplomacy, and it's taking shape quite well, I should say. And in 2016, Public Diplomacy Act was enacted to support public diplomacy activities with the legal basis required for it, especially for the budget part. I'm sorry, but I think I'm the co-host. That's why I'm seeing all these notices for people to be admitted, and it's a little bit distracting. If there is another way I could share my slides without being a co-host, it would be great. But otherwise, I'll leave it. No problem. Okay, and the budget. Again, within this very short, a decade evolution, the increase in the Korean public diplomacy budget is also enormous. In 2010, the budget was about 5.3 million US dollars, yugok, I think, sorry, yuksibok, I think in Korean. It was 5.3 million initially, and later with some additional budget from another ministry, it was increased to 7 million USD. And last year, the budget was 350 million USD, almost 60 times increase. So it's an enormous increase. Still much less than many other countries, but doing this within a decade is an enormous job. And what is it that Korea expects from public diplomacy to do? If I go back to my definition, or the definition that is quite widely used in public diplomacy literature, public diplomacy expects to create a basis to support foreign policy goals. So it's very much linked to foreign policy goals. And for South Korea, the major foreign policy goals are outlined in South Korea's diplomatic white papers, and public diplomacy is mentioned always, these are screenshots of different white papers, diplomatic white papers. It's always mentioned in the same chapter, which is often the 5th chapter, which talks about extending Korea's role in international society and enhancing status. And it's often discussed in line with Korea's contributions to global governance, development cooperation, international peace, also Korea's involvement in other international organizations, multilateral diplomacy, middle power diplomacy, which covers pretty much all of these other things, which are mentioned earlier, and public diplomacy is a section in here. So major goals for Korea, foreign policy goals, would be being a major power, which didn't change since especially Park Chung-hee era and all of the presidents who came after him. Korea wants to take the initiative, wants to take its fate into its own hands. Kim Dae-jung administration used this concept a lot. We want to take our own fate into our own hands, so that we don't have to depend on, rely too much on major powers such as the United States or what happens between the United States and China. So in order to have this foreign policy independence, South Korea needs to have a status that is accepted by others, because you cannot decide your own status. Status is accorded by others, because status is social. It's given in a social hierarchy, and you are accorded it by others. And Korea is often portrayed as shrimp among whales, and this is not good for the country's independence. So for Korea to be independent, it needs to be one of those whales. And public diplomacy cannot achieve that, but public diplomacy can support other foreign policy goals to create the basis at the grassroots level to support foreign policy goals to that end. To give more context, 2008, 2009 was kind of the golden years of creating this narrative for Korea's public diplomacy under Lee Myung-bak administration. Lee Myung-bak suggests that Korea is the world's 13th largest economy with some 20,000 USD per income, in per capita income, but ranks only 33rd in the global brand index. He's referring to the index by Simon Anholt and his team. This is a huge problem. And we see that a decade later, 2019 Soft Power 30 Index, Korea ranks number 9 in terms of enterprise. So these first 5 sub-indices are more or less objective data. It's based on actual statistics, so they are not opinions of public. And according to these more objective indicators, Korea ranks number 9 in terms of enterprise, number 12 in terms of education, number 12 in terms of culture, 16 in terms of international engagement, number 19 in terms of government. But it ranks only 23rd out of 30 countries. This is not global. It included only 30 countries in the study. 23rd out of 30 countries in terms of international public opinion. So the same problem that Lee Myung-bak mentioned is still there. So one of the tasks of Korean public diplomacy is to change this, to make Korea reach the level that is commensurate with its capabilities in the eyes of foreign publics, hence public diplomacy. So what is public diplomacy according to this Public Diplomacy Act, which was enacted in 2016? Article 2 defines it as activities through which Korea enhances foreigners' understanding of and confidence in Korea. And what are the basic principles of public diplomacy? It's not only promoting Korea, but it's also reflecting the universal values in addition to Korea's characteristics, And it is also supposed to be focusing on the promotion of sustainable and friendly cooperation for amicable relations with the international community. So this is quite enlightened understanding of public diplomacy, which is informed by this literature on new public diplomacy, the relatively evolved version of public diplomacy. And Article 1, I changed the order of articles to have the purpose at the end. So what is it that Korean public diplomacy to do? What is it expected to achieve? And its purpose is to contribute to improve Korea's image and prestige in the international community. But this is, again, this is a milestone, but this is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to instrumentally benefit from this image and prestige in the international community, which is, again, in line with Korea's foreign policy goals, one of which is, again, what I said earlier, foreign policy independence, not being reliant on the United States or China or the competition between them, and thereby enjoying a more secure foreign policy environment. These are all also mentioned in Blue House reports on Presidential Council on Nation Branding in 2009 by Ewha administration, which also talks about improving Korea's place or improving the so-called Korea discount and shifting it, changing it to Korea premium. We need to improve Korea's reputation in a groundbreaking manner to win respect in the international community so that we can be on par with advanced countries. So the concept of advanced countries is almost consistently used since Park Chung-hee up until today. And the time is now right for Korea to strive to become a more dignified country and to find its place among the ranks of advanced nations. So these are Korea's public diplomacy goals in line with its foreign policy goals. And what is Korea doing in the field? And I'll give a few examples of Korean public diplomacy activities. Korea Foundation is the main agent of Korean public diplomacy. One of the major tasks they do is promoting Korean studies by creating professorships, positions, sponsoring those positions abroad, as well as offering e-school lectures, providing grants for research related to Korea. Another very unique event by Korea Foundation, United States has similar programs, Israel has similar programs, US programs, and US citizens' participation in public diplomacy is enormous. So it has a history and experience, and it's much more customized per country. Israel is also a unique case, but much more state-led. Korea Foundation's initiative, in which Korean citizens create their own teams. They don't necessarily need an organization. They can just create their own teams, come up with an idea, apply for, write their proposal, apply for it, and if their idea is accepted, the idea is for free from Korea Foundation's perspective. The people's salaries are not paid. Only the initiative that is proposed is paid. So it's saving a lot of budget with this. Another very important point is that public diplomacy in the long term aims to achieve building and managing of relationships between the host country and the home country. And it's very difficult for diplomats or staff members to build relationships and manage them in the long run. And it's not very, so the chemistry is not there. On the one side, there is some asymmetry there. If you expect, for example, Korean diplomats to build these relationships, these people are supposed to do it because they're on salary. So from, let's say, a Filipino's perspective, well, this person is building relationship with me because she is paid to do so, right? But when it comes to people-to-people diplomacy, these relationships can be more natural. These people are interested in having exchanges, interactions with foreign publics. That's why they write their proposals. They can build relationships with their counterparts in other countries, no power asymmetry, no hierarchical relationship. They're just ordinary people. They are not paid to do so. And they are doing this activity, building natural relationships, and hopefully can maintain those relationships in the long run. So it's a very innovative initiative, and they are not doing something that Korea Foundation asks them to do. They are doing their own proposal, based on their own idea, and thereby contributing to Korean public diplomacy. And it's very important that citizens are involved, because governments have their disadvantages in public diplomacy, such as, for example, it's taken for granted that a government would promote its policies, but it's not taken for granted that the citizens would do so. And it may be seen as propaganda when the governments do as so. One example is from Ivory Coast, I think, a very two-way symmetrical exchange. They're not only promoting Korean music, they're also learning Ivory Coast music and dance, and they're performing together. And here, music is not the goal. The goal is building and managing relations. Music is only an excuse to do so. Korea is one of the leaders now in international education field, international student mobility. Global Korea Scholarship is Korea's government scholarship for international students. It began in 1967, but for the 4 decades, the number of students was only slightly above 1,000, whereas only in 2020, it gave more than that. So it's becoming an elite scholarship. And I'm very proud to say that I'm an alumni myself of Global Korea Scholarship, and I have around 8 articles, some of which are in press forthcoming on Global Korea Scholarship. So I'm also doing research on Global Korea Scholarship myself, and I'm happy to say that it's becoming an elite scholarship, reaching the ranks of Fulbright and Chevening and others. And its reach is also enormous. It has given scholarship to students from 156 countries, pretty much all countries that Korea has diplomatic relations with, most of those countries. While Global Korea Scholarship is for degree programs, KOICA also offers scholarships for government officials and diplomats, for them to be trained in Korea so that they can have a more complex understanding of Korea and its policies, as well as building relations with Koreans, as well as other KOICA fellows from other countries. So it's creating a huge network of government officials in developing countries, including, as far as I know, the Philippines. World Friends Korea is the voluntary corps operated by KOICA, and it's the second largest one, following US Peace Corps. So Korean volunteers go to developing countries to help with development projects. GPDNet is a global public diplomacy network, and it was initiated by Korea Foundation in 2013. You can see me in the picture here, young me. So this is a huge initiative, global public diplomacy network of public diplomacy agencies of middle power countries. I think Philippines is also included there, if I remember correctly. Although it is now international, it was initiated by and very much supported and sponsored by Korea Foundation. And Public Diplomacy 3.0. So this is Anna Park, former ambassador for public diplomacy, who's currently the ambassador to UK. She said public diplomacy 1.0 is about informing others about your country. Public diplomacy 2.0 is about building two-way relations or engaging in two-way communication. And public diplomacy 3.0 is the most evolved version of public diplomacy, going beyond your national interests, going beyond promotion of your country, but focusing on global issues that are human-centric, that are nature-centric. which is often we see that Nordic European countries do, or Canada, Australia to some extent do. And Korea is not there yet, she said, but we are moving towards there. And this is a direction for Korean public diplomacy. K-pop. I never mentioned K-pop almost in this lecture. It's because it's run by entertainment companies who are doing it for private interests. But due to this popularity of K-pop and other Korean entertainment, there is huge interest in Korea, in Philippines, in other countries as well. If it stays only as interest in Korean pop culture, it's a huge opportunity missed for Korean public diplomacy. So Korean public diplomacy policymakers should see this as a conversation starter. K-pop, not for K-pop's sake, or Korean pop culture, not for its sake, in terms of public diplomacy I'm talking, but see it as a conversation starter and move it to the next stage in line with foreign policy goals. For example, do we want more international students to come? Let's engage with Korea fans who have their own forums, who have their own networks in different countries. Embassies and cultural centers can engage them, and do engage them indeed, to move the conversation to the next stage. Managing relations with them, helping them understand Korea in different ways, Korean language, Korean education in Korea, or tourism in Korea, or building networks between these people in their local communities and their counterparts in Korea, and so on. So whatever the public diplomacy objectives and foreign policy goals are, the conversation can be moved to next stage based on that. This is all for me. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayhan, for the very insightful and comprehensive presentation. Our second speaker for today is a professor of communication at Seoul National University. Among her various publications on cultural studies and mass communication, she is notable for her book BTS on the Road, published in 2020, which explores the role of BTS overseas fandoms, or also called ARMY, and social networking services in shaping Korean cultural content. She finished her doctoral degree in Information and Communication Science at the University Grenoble III in France, with her summa cum laude dissertation entitled Actuality Regime and Reality Construction in Everyday Life, a contribution to the pragmatic analysis of television. To discuss her insights on Hallyu 3.0 and the global rise of cultural industries, let us all welcome Dr. Seok-kyeong Hong. Dr. Hong, the floor is yours.
So, thank you for inviting me. And thank you for also to Dr. Ayhan for his very good introduction of what means public diplomacy, because I have to say that I'm not a scholar of public diplomacy, and it is very new for me as a set of thoughts. But I try to develop my experience as a scholar to be helpful to develop ideas between Hallyu, the popularity of Korean popular culture abroad, and public diplomacy for 21st century. I will share my my PPT. Okay, can you see that? Is it okay for?
Yes, we can see your screen, Dr. Hong.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I've been teaching in university since 2000, between 2000 and 2013, in University of Bordeaux, France, and since 2013 in Seoul National University in Korea. I published these books. The first one, Hallyu in the Globalization and Digital Cultural Era, published in 2013, is on the global reception of Korean drama, written while I'm in France. The second one, published in 2014, 12 is about BTS phenomenon, written through interviews with fans that I met on the spots of BTS World Tour. The third one, published this year, is, as the title of the book clearly means, about the ways how the East Asian pop culture is formed through years of cultural exchanges and multilateral relationships between nations, practices, and imaginations sometimes. And so my presentation today will be based on these publications and ongoing researches. As a cultural studies researcher, my presentation today will not focus on the cultural industry itself and how powerful Hallyu is for boosting Korean economy neither, or diplomacy. But I concentrate on the new environment mediation, which has impacts on the way Hallyu develops. So first of all, I explain rapidly three different mediation regimes of Hallyu, which from the late 1990s to today have framed the way how Hallyu enlarged its range and power. As you know, the Korean wave has come without any sign and preparation and shocked many people and produced various knowledge and beliefs concerning its causes and agencies and effects. So far, secondly, I discuss some misconceptions which have been accumulated and prevail nowadays in this field. They have provoked some misunderstandings and contradictions for the right understanding of Hallyu in this rapidly transforming media environment. Thirdly and last, through the successful cases of BTS and Netflix, I'll explain the important aspects to consider for the future of a better Korean public diplomacy. So how to define Hallyu? The case that Korean songs became popular abroad was not rare, from the man with the yellow shirt in the 60s to the popularity of Korean singers in Japan in the 70s and 80s even. But the popularity of dramas, they exploded simultaneously in many Asian countries in the late 90s and early 2000 is an unexpected success beyond every imagination. After the naming of the phenomenon by the Chinese media as a Hallyu, Korean wave is now understood as the successful spread and reception of Korean popular culture abroad, as well as the additional phenomena brought by it as a K-beauty, fashion, tourism, etc. Since Hallyu become prominent, there have been attempts to categorize it according to changes in domestic cultural industry and policy. For example, as Dr. Ayhan explained, President Lee Myung-bak tried to promote about abroad Korean food and hanbok, Korean traditional clothes, for example. And some media and scholars consider this attempt as a turning point and name it as a special period. However, considering that Hallyu is a phenomenon of cultural acceptance and reception abroad, it is more appropriate to understand it based on changes in mediation and reception mechanism, not that of agency-driven propagation. The first phase consists of the rise of Hallyu in East Asia, about from 2000 to 2010. During this period, Hallyu was initially regional phenomenon, resulting in the Trans-Asian commercial trade of TV programs in East Asian broadcasting market, with the terrestrial and satellite broadcasting as intermediaries. As a result, the audience was national, and the Hallyu provoked vivid reactions from each domestic media. It's the period of a huge success of some Korean dramas like Winter Sonata, Autumn Tale, Jewel in the Palace, Full House, and Hallyu stars were acclaimed in Asia. Second period comes from 2005 to around 2015, I say. Using streaming service enabled by rapidly developing internet, Hallyu spread worldwide thanks to the active subtitling and sharing of its ever-growing audience. This happened without any institutional mediation. It is also the period that East Asian cross-media production met big success, as is the case of Boys Over Flowers. And the success of drama was normal entirely depending on that of a terrestrial diffusion. As is the case of You're Beautiful, this drama was a sensation on the online, while its domestic audience was just ordinary at the time. Third phases come with global VOD. Global VOD platforms are transforming world media sphere by its transnationality and AI-driven mediation. Now, many Korean contents are diffused through global subscription VOD and video on demand, and consumed by viewers around the world, along with other global content. Especially Netflix is very actively engaged with Korean contents. Netflix mediates the viewing with a unique interface system, multiple genre profiles, and AI-driven recommendation systems, etc. Its increasing investment in Hallyu proven successful, and I'll talk more about it later. This phase is also marked by a new Hallyu energy. BTS and K-pop are on global success with the power of their worldwide fandoms. I will also talk more about this, about especially the lessons we can get from this later in this presentation. So I will talk about some misconceptions of Hallyu. First, it's a well-documented fact that the Korean wave is not a propagation but a reception phenomenon. Hallyu is a phenomenon caused by a combination of factors such as quality growth of Korean popular culture, and especially the digital media environment, and not the result of any intentional propagation. However, it is difficult for diplomats and policymakers to digest this and carry out policies that match it, because soft power or cultural attraction is a power based on a voluntary agreement or volitional support that cannot be made intentionally. Like interpersonal attraction, maintaining and promoting this is a tricky and difficult task. Korea has not completely escaped from the image of a developing country in the past due to or thanks to its rapid economic growth under state governance. Korean government tried to utilize and emphasize popular culture in its efforts to improve its image. The abolition of various cultural censorship in the 1990s and the recognition of the importance of the cultural industry as a result of Korea's democratization in the 80s, I say, led to more active cultural policies than in the past. It's true. But I mentioned earlier, Hallyu was not the result of governmental policy, but the government's efforts to support the Korean wave Hallyu after its outbreak made the foreign elites, intermediaries, consider Hallyu a result of the government's export support policy, not as an organic result of cultural ability of the nation. This is an attitude found in the media in Europe and North America and can be called colonial thought. This attitude is also found in elite mediators in other regions who internalized this colonial attitude. This colonial attitude can be witnessed, especially in the way the K-pop's achievements are constantly questioned and through the criticism of idol culture. Second, many aspects of K-culture are no more reserved to Koreans, especially in K-pop. K-pop groups made up of foreigners have already been formed in Japan, in United Kingdom, and United States, and Vietnam, and the Philippines. Look at this. Idol group SB19, you can see right here, created in the Philippines by a Korean planner, surprised the world by being nominated for Billboard Social Artist 2020, the last year, which was possible in a very K-pop-like way through an ardent and organized fandoms supporting using social media. SBTC's agency Hybe purchased the American company named Ithaca we can normally say that K-pop groups made up of Americans will soon be born through an audition, television audition, as we have in Korea these days, but this time in the United States. Oh, I'll go. No, oh, yeah. When the actual content of Korean wave changes in this way, how to logically and reasonably adapt this trend to the policies of national image of Korea? It will become a complicated issue for Korean public diplomacy, I think. Now is the time to break away from the fixed status of Hallyu, like Korean produced content in South Korea, and take a broader view on the universality of the historical, social, and cultural experiences and values created by the Korean nation state and civil society. Research and studies shows us that Korea has universal values and meanings that Hallyu embodies and transports abroad. I'll talk more about it treating Netflix's Korean drama later. For a long time, it has been said that Hallyu is supported by the nostalgic middle-aged women alienated from the male-dominated country, or the passionate fandom of young women toward Korean idol stars, or the population with a minority gender or racial identity. However, Korean popular culture showed the formation of a strong fandom through phase 1 and phase 2, and it is now phase 3, through the global success of BTS and K-pop and that of Korean programs on Netflix. Its audience is no longer composed of women, young people, or minorities in each society, but a larger spectrum of people that includes all ages and ethnicities and genders. The success of BTS, which has held the number 1 spot on the Billboard for 15 weeks in this year, has been the subject of numerous questions. What makes BTS different from other K-pop groups? In a neoliberal world, in the midst of a crisis of class decline and the pressure of constant self-development and competition, BTS gave the depressed young people the reason and strength to break free from self-hatred and to learn how to love themselves. In addition, in the reality that the primary group has been disbanding, BTS provides to their fandom a new sense of inclusivity and safety too. In sum, BTS as a group is successful because they spread social cultural values and messages along with quality music and performances. So BTS have become recognized individuals who can preach universal messages and values and spoke on behalf of the youth in front of the United Nations. During the pandemic, BTS and K-pop develop further through online concerts and other way. BTS produced music aiming to comfort the whole world. Permission to Dance is a good example. When we watch the music videos, it includes all people, including minorities and disabled people. Let's talk about Netflix now. Netflix first launched its streaming service to US consumers in 2007 and to Koreans in 2016. Netflix actively purchased Korean programs that proved to be a content powerhouse in East Asia and started introducing Korean Netflix original content starting 2018. With the growth of Netflix during the pandemic, Korean movies and television dramas have successfully been received all over the world. We can see the result in this diagram. According to the daily top 10 analysis of 49 countries around the world in 2020, Korean movies ranked 5th and dramas ranked 2nd place. And Korean content occupies 3rd place in total. after the US and the UK programs. Especially in Asia, during the pandemic, Korean dramas such as Crash Landing on You, Itaewon Class, and Psycho But It's Okay were a huge success. Interviews with viewers around the world who watch Korean dramas through Netflix let us know these things. Korea is a safe country, especially during the pandemic. A country which has cities with beautiful parks and nature. A country with dynamic urban space and values of diversity, as we can see in Itaewon Class. A country with romance that respects each other's feelings. A country where young people are still polite to the elders. The current state achieved by Korean society is considered as a result of political and socio-cultural struggles. In sum, viewers of K-drama through Netflix are building the perception of Korea as an open society that produces inclusive content, rarely seen in other East Asian countries. They are also cultivating historical and political curiosity about Korea and providing an opportunity to reflect on the relationship between Korea and their own country. Finally, they think that Korean drama's quality has improved and showcases a unique aesthetic. For conclusion, I'd like to say that the pandemic has increased the consumption of a media culture, and Hallyu has been recognized for its value. This goes beyond simple cultural and industrial interests or even foreign policy gains. It shows that Korean popular culture is being received and acknowledged as a global popular culture too. For Korean public diplomacy, it's time to consider the changed status of Korea and the present state of the Hallyu. It needs to adopt more comprehensive, bilateral, and more value-oriented policies. For example, it's time to support more actively the development of popular culture in other countries, giving consultants from the successful experience of Hallyu rather than utilizing Hallyu content to promote Korea's image. It also the time to improve working conditions for the cultural workers of Hallyu rather than encouraging competition in the Korean cultural industry. The most important thing is to train multiculturally sensitive workers in the Korean cultural industry. In order to produce equally culturally sensitive content, considering increasing conflicts as cultural appropriation, stereotypes, and misrepresentations of other people and countries, and so on. So there will be more other resolutions and solutions and expectations from the things that I said in this presentation, but I'll stop here. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong, for your engaging and informative remarks. And we hope that we can get a copy of your book very soon. For our discussant for today's event, she is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. She is also an editor for various academic journals, such as the Philippine Sociological Review, Hanpil, Studies of Korea and the Philippines, and Asian Politics and Policy. Her academic works focus on migrant organizations, migration and multiculturalism in South Korea, and sociology of everyday life, among others. She received her master's degree in Philippine Studies at UP Diliman and her doctorate degree in sociology at the National University of Singapore. To share her insights on the previous discussions and to expand the current discussion to the implications of the Korean wave for social-cultural relations between the Philippines and South Korea, let us all welcome our discussant, Dr. Bubbles Beverly Asor. Dr. Asor, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Anton. So I am tasked to kind of synthesize and kind of tie the two presentations together and to do. And thank you very much to Dr. Ayhan and Dr. Hong for those fascinating presentations. And it is quite an opportunity for Filipino audience, either academics or the public or from the government or from non-state institutions to listen to the perspectives and insights of our Korean specialists from South Korea. And to do that, I will try to tie those two presentations together by linking public diplomacy and Hallyu or Korean wave as a heuristic tool. And to do that, I will be focusing on what is now called the cultural diplomacy, framing it with, I know, debatably and arguably Joseph Nye's concept of soft power. Let me share my screen. Okay, just to give brief synthesis of what we just heard today. So from the work of and from the presentation of Dr. Ayhan, we were introduced and we were presented with the changing conceptualization and the practices of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy or the hardcore diplomacy have always been related to, let's say, changing the perspectives and shaping the opinions of people, communicating informations and ideas and values from one state to the other. And along the way, there is a shift or a transmutation to what is now called the new public diplomacy, whereby, as Dr. Ayhan aptly presented to us, there is now a kind of more salient role of non-state actors in public diplomacy, as we have seen in the non-state and private enterprise, private organizations, state institutions, and non-state actors, where South Korean processes, South Korean cultural products, South Korean ideas and values are transmitted and mediated by the non-state actors, as in the case, let's say, of Korean Foundation, although funded perhaps by the Korean government, but it has its kind of autonomy in its work, or KOICA, for example. So there are those work being done by both the state and the non-state actors, and they play a more important role, as Dr. Ayhan mentioned to us, because of the people-to-people interactions. We recognize and we appreciate the role of the more formal institutions, such as diplomats and state actors, however, who interact with state is through the people-to-people relations as one of the pillars of the New Southern Policy. In the presentation of Dr. Ayhan, we also had a glean of a more nuanced approach to public diplomacy, where there are more multiple intentions, like what are the stakes there of the state, who are benefiting from those kinds of activities, for example. There are also various processes going on. Are they cooperating? Is it more at the level of co-opting? Is it more at the level of more superficial kind of relations? And we can see in one of his slides in the presentation where time frame is very important, because the people-to-people relations may not be as intensive and may not be as meaningful without the time frame. How many months do these people interact with each other? And there are unintended outcomes. The shorter the interactions between two groups of people, whether at various levels, whether at the individual level, group level, or at the state level or organizational level, the time frame is very important in this relationship, diplomatically or socially. Another very salient aspect of Dr. Ayhan's presentation is the role of citizens in public diplomacy, or the citizen approach. And I would say that in the older version of diplomacy or public diplomacy, it is more top-down, where the state plays a more important role, while in the citizens approach, although this may not have been well documented and well researched at the moment, there is this intention to make it more bottom-up approach. We try to understand that when we talk about diplomacy, the target population is the foreign publics. But at the same time, the domestic publics, in the case of South Korea, is the Korean public. They also play their opinion. Their public opinion plays a very important role in the decision-making of a state like South Korea in terms of diplomacy and state-to-state relations, whether it's multilateral or whether it is bilateral relations. And my job here is to really link public diplomacy from the works of Dr. Ayhan and the works of Dr. Hong through Hallyu as a space, as a cultural space, as a cultural product, or maybe you may want to call it as a cultural artifact, or maybe as a cultural process. How do we link them together? This is, in a way, through Hallyu as an illustration. And when we say Hallyu, there have been changes and evolutions of the genres and the products that non-Koreans have consumed. It started with, let's say, drama and TV shows, and then from that to food, and then to tourism, for example. So there are multiple genres and multiple products that are being consumed and introduced to us as well. We have to understand that when we talk about cultural, whether consumerism or cultural process, this is always a two-way relationship, in the same manner that diplomacy is a two-way communication between the target foreign country and the South Korea in this case. In the production and the consumption of cultural products as well, like Hallyu, consumers and the product itself have a very interesting relationship as well, and very proactive. What we consume should be aligned to what we need and what we want at that moment, and I will discuss that later. And we have seen, and it's very insightful for us to listen to the evolution of Hallyu, some works of Korean specialists like Dr. Hong and Dalyun, Dr. Kim, for example. They talk about 1.0, 2.0, and now it's a 3.0. From Hallyu 2.0 to 3.0, the ICT, or the communications and technology, play a very important role in the dissemination of cultural products. At the same time, there is also hybridization. The Philippines may not be in the forefront of the consumers of Hallyu. We may not have consumed a Hallyu from the very start with a Hallyu 1.0, but some consumers of this, or some, those who are consuming Hallyu products, for example, or cultural products, Korean cultural products, may not be aware that what we appreciate and what we consume are actually hybridization of what is modern or what is Western, and then what could be called the more traditional aspects of Korean culture. I will explain that later, and that is the attraction of many of the fans and consumers of Hallyu. Once Hallyu and Korean cultural products have been institutionalized as one of the cultural products in the world, it has been received very warmly and excitedly very recently. Hence, there is such a thing as global reception, and the internet, YouTube, and Netflix play a very important role here. And maybe the next question that we have to ask is it the acceptance of Korean culture at par, as mentioned by by the speakers, like, is it at par with other superpower cultural products like American and Japanese cultural products? Yeah, on my end, let us return a little back again with what is public diplomacy. Although it has been presented and defined to us very well, I would be drawing from this definition, very broad definition, but I think it will make us tie the concept of public diplomacy and cultural product or culture or Hallyu together. It is a means of capturing the hearts and minds of foreign public. So the target population is the foreign public, but at the same time, the opinion of the domestic publics, in this case, the Korean publics, play a very important role as well of what we will be presenting to the foreign public, what will we be transmitting, what will be transposing to the foreign publics, what aspects of our culture, what aspects of our values and ideas will be transmitted. And in here, as presented in the two lectures, it is not just the private enterprise doing that, it is also the state. There are many different social actors in that arena or field of what we call as public diplomacy. The difference between public diplomacy and cultural relations is that cultural relations does not have the role and the presence of the state, while public diplomacy, the presence of the state is there and very visible. For public diplomacy, according to Joseph Nye, it is arguable the concept of soft power, but I still think it is useful here, is the ability of, in this case, South Korea, to make other states strive for common goals, right? I believe South Korea has now achieved what is now called the middle power status. It is emerging as a power in the region, and at the same time, South Asia, Northeast Asia, we are very interested as scholars and maybe as consumers of cultural products from South Korea is ability of the South Korean government to make other states, such as the Philippines, strive for the same goal. And I think what is important is for South Korea to be very clear of what is its goal as a middle power or as an emerging power in the global stage. When we say soft power, according to Joseph Nye, it is wielded through attraction. It can be more understandable and observable and in many ways measurable if there is an attraction to the values and the goals that that particular state is presenting to other states. When the power is very attractive, it will lead to what is called the persuasive element of power. And power here is not about economic power, which is considered to be hard power, or military power, but this is more part of what is called cultural power in the sense soft power through culture. And then once power or resources have been established and legitimized as attractive and persuasive, then there would be cooperation among those states which believe or which agree consensually that they are sharing some common goals. So what are the uses of soft power? And I'm just presenting it to tie those two presentations together. It is the state's ability to access large channels and amounts of information. Hence, the NSP or the New Southern Policy relies on not just the economic and military power, and actually they are trying to, deviate and depart from that. So they are now gearing towards more the technological aspect of resources, state resources. The other use of soft power through culture. And culture here is loosely and broadly defined. It can include, the more contemporary cultural products and the more traditional cultural products. It can be from food. It can be through education. It can be through exchanges and interactions of the people. The next one is the closeness of states' ideological culture to global norms and values. And we can see it, the examples of these global norms and values could be liberalism, pluralism, and democracy. So the closer the ideological culture, or in the works or the more hegemonic idea of culture. When we say hegemony, and I'm not using it very negatively, it means that it has its power over other cultures, right? It is ideological because in many ways, the other state wants to influence and shape the decision-making of the other states. When it's closer to global norms like democracy, it's closer to global norms such as liberalism, it means that culture from South Korea will be more attractive and more persuasive to the target audience. And as we all know, as the credibility of the states increases, so should it soft power. And the soft power, the culture becomes more legitimate, the culture becomes more attractive and desirable. Now, what is the attraction towards Korean cultural products? We have already established that yes, cultural diplomacy is a subset of public diplomacy. Yes, it has a very positive effect, but we haven't really, maybe we haven't really thought about this, especially from this side of the globe where we are consuming cultural products. What is the attraction, right? This is from the work of Lee, and Lee is I think this is a Current Affairs magazine, and I got it from there. And I'm not sure if you know Baeyeongjun. These are the first batch of the cultural products exported to many countries in the winters, in the TV series Winter Sonata, and it was very huge. It has a very huge impact on the Japanese audience, and it led to what was called the Yon-sama syndrome. And then this current affairs magazine says, while we feel proud of ourselves, having become a cultural exporter, we are puzzled as to what in our culture is enchanting the foreigners, right? And in the works of Chua Beng-wat and in the works of Chua Beng-wat, they called it puzzled pleasure for ordinary Koreans. They may be, it's always a puzzle. Let's say, well, what is it about the South Korean culture that makes it very attractive? In that work, in that book, and I agree with that, and based on my few interactions and interviews with some consumers of Korean drama and Korean music, I would say that it is the melding and the coming together of traditional values such as pure love, pure romance, or the desire for it, or the imaginary of it, and the practice of family values, plus combining this with modern ideas such as individuality, technical sophistication when it comes to TV series and TV drama, and they say, oh, it looks like Hollywood movies at the individual level in terms of viewers' pleasure, or even at the group level or fandom with shared reality that yes, this combination of modern values and modernity and traditional values make us feel good, hence the viewer's pleasure, right? Also, in the works of Chua and Ewha, they also say that there is a kind of identification by Asian consumers, such as Singaporeans, Malaysians, and the Filipinos, and even Japanese consumers, that you can identify with the South Korean cultural products, but at the same time, I am not like them. And they call it the identification and the distancing of desires and imaginary. If we abstract it, further, we can say that South Korea, the attraction of South Korea, why we are attracted to South Korean culture, is it is a form and an illustration of the centering of globalization, that the core of globalization is not just the United States, it's not just China, for example, or UK or Japan, but also other parts of the world. And Eisenstadt call it part of the multiple modernities, and I call it more of an alternative modernity from what we have been used to. And as a result, what is the implication of this is South Korea's positioning in the geopolitical stage and cultural order has also increased. I don't have a lot of time, and I will leave you with some points of discussion that perhaps the audience and our presenters can discuss, is how to differentiate South Korean cultural diplomacy from cultural relations. I think I mentioned it, and Dr. First speaker also discussed about what is the difference between diplomacy and propaganda. Usually propaganda is at the earlier stage. They send artists and the intellectuals. They mobilize the intellectuals and artists in the service of the state propaganda. This is a bit tricky. Maybe they're not doing that anymore, but in the tourism advertisements of South Korea, we can still see a lot of artists being mobilized to introduce South Korean tourism to the rest of the world. And I think my question really is, what is really Korean culture? Is it the hybridized culture that makes it very attractive? Because even if they have historical dramas that they export to us, even without historical knowledge, we can relate to those drama. And I think it's because of the core values are still there, such as the desire for individuality, the desire for freedom, juxtaposed with the desire of maintaining traditional values such as family values. And what is it about Hallyu that makes it a very compelling tool of cultural diplomacy, and how to go beyond the nation branding? The nation branding is in a very marketing tactic. How do we go beyond it, especially for South Korean diplomats? How to sustain the attraction towards Korean cultural products so that it can be transmuted into more long-term resources and not just a very short-lived resource of a kind of marketing strategy. And what does South Korea represent to non-Koreans? Is it that tension between development and maintaining traditional values? Is it the very fast, rapid modernity in the Miracle of Han that makes it very attractive, credible, and legitimate as a cultural producer, but also as a international actor? And I will leave. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asor, for your invaluable comments and insights in linking public diplomacy and the Korean wave. So this session is now open for questions and comments. You may send them through the Zoom or YouTube live chat box. If possible, please introduce yourself with your affiliation while raising your question. So to begin our open forum, I hope it's okay to ask Dr. Ayhan and Dr. Hong if you have any reactions to Dr. Asor's discussion. Let's start first with Dr. Ayhan.
Not at this moment.
Okay. How about you, Dr. Hong? Do you have any input or reaction?
Oh, yes. It was very insightful synthesis and questions. In our so cultural studies scholars. So this the questions made by Dr. Asor was the questions very common questions we ask for ourselves, but the answers are not very easy to do to give and produce. So what is these common goals that that Korea can produce for other countries through cultural influence, and this why that the question I make myself for in studying BTS's influence, and I underlined in my presentation that their popularity is based on their capacity to produce value and messages for the youth in the whole world, and make themselves individuals capable to have to preach that they have a voice in the international stage, as is the case for the in United Nations. So this one a very good example that how Korean popular culture can produce, can invite the people from the countries toward the common goals, as even though it is for the youth, but BTS's popularity is growing and louder and going more large. So this is what I thought and listening Dr. Asor. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong. So let's read some of the questions that we have collected throughout the session. So we have a question from Assistant Secretary Eduardo Meñez, the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy of the DSA. Welcome, sir, for attending this program. He raised a question for Dr. Ayhan. Since there was a mention of a budget allocated to public diplomacy in the Foreign Ministry of South Korea, he'd like to ask, what is the percentage share of public diplomacy budget in relation to the other two pillars of Korean foreign policy?
Okay, I didn't readily have the answer to this question, but I just saw the question and I did my research right now as we speak. It seems that Korean budget for Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2020 was just a second, about 2.6 billion Korean won, or sorry, it's about 2.4 billion USD, and I found the ratio to be around 15%. I just closed down the calculator. That's why I'm trying to find it back. Okay, here, history. Oh, history is not there. Okay, anyways, it was around 15%. So public diplomacy budget was around 15% of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs budget. One
Thank
type.
you very much.
15.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ayhan. We have another question for you, Dr. Ayhan. This is from Mr. Dom Jason Sauro. What major public diplomacy projects has Korea executed that greatly contributed to the status of Korea's development today?
Can you repeat the question?
Sorry. What major public diplomacy projects has Korea executed that contributed to the status of Korea's development?
Korea's development in terms of?
I think he did not mention what kind of development, but I assume this is more of like a socio-economic development into a highly developed country.
Again, this is very difficult to answer at this moment because in order to evaluate what might have been a successful public diplomacy program, we need to first define what are the expected outcomes. And Korean public diplomacy history is very new. And so far, for the last 11 years, the focus has been pretty much on cultural diplomacy. And I think the main reason why its focus has been on cultural diplomacy is because of kind of path dependence. Because when there was no public diplomacy, there was cultural diplomacy in Korea. Indeed, when public diplomacy was first introduced in 2010, it was under a Cultural Diplomacy Bureau as a smaller division. Indeed, you would expect cultural diplomacy to be smaller than public diplomacy and under it, but it was the other way around in Korea in 2010. So for the last 11 years, I'm guessing because of this path dependency, the focus has mainly been on cultural diplomacy. And is K-pop or Korean Wave because of that? I don't think so. They have their own, again, Professor Hong knows much better than me on this topic. But as far as I can tell, it's mainly the success of entertainment companies and the stars themselves. And the government have been kind of riding that popularity. But I'm not sure if we can evaluate its success and its contribution to Korea's development in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ayhan. Okay, for our next question, this is for Dr. Hong. So this is from Mr. Edwin Estrada, a researcher at the Foreign Service Institute. His question is, with the overwhelming popularity of K-pop and K-movies and telenovelas, should the entertainment industry be recognized as a key instrument to promoting culture and improving nation branding? Do you have any thoughts on this, Dr. Hong?
Oh, can you repeat the questions? I cannot hear. Yeah, very well. Yeah.
Okay. With the overwhelming popularity of K-pop and K-movies and telenovelas, should the entertainment industry be recognized as a key instrument to promoting culture and improving nation branding?
Oh, I understand vaguely that the question is about their how recognize their contribution to cultural diplomacy for Korea, isn't it that?
Yes.
Oh, in Korea, I have to say that we don't present questions like this because the governments, especially during the President Lee Myung-bak, tried to and Park Geun-hye tried to make connections between public diplomacy or foreign diplomacy or foreign diplomacy, use the popularity of a Korean wave when they try to develop. When they, for example, under the president go abroad, and they love to show themselves with some Hallyu stars in public scene, something like that. They try to have a positive influence from to take positive influence from popularity of Korean popular culture, but the result is not very good. As I said in my presentation, neither in this estimation from the foreign intermediaries, intellectuals, that because this kind of practice have what I say that consolidate that their belief that Korean popular culture is related by governmental, political, what I say, political ideas and policies, but and neither it is not very well received by people or the fans, especially fans of the Hallyu, that they don't like that their stars are used politically, even in abroad or in Korea. So I think that the direct relationship between the politics and culture will not produce very good results. Yeah, the past said that, and even now, and even in the future, I think.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong. In relation to that, we also have a follow-up question regarding the extent of government support to the entertainment industry of Korea. The follow-up question is, how much support does the Korean government give to the entertainment industry? And how much is the contribution of the entertainment industry to the Korean economy? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, I'm not a very good person to answer that, because I'm not very sure that Korean government investment help really the development of Korean cultural industry. I don't think that they help. It helps in a sense that gives money in terms of competition or development of some startups, etc. But when we make questions like that, if we don't have this money, governmental money, as the Korean cultural industry cannot be developed as now, I don't think so. And second, how much the second question is how the cultural industry make money. Is there are scholars who calculate like this. The BTS's new song and on Billboard 100 and 200 makes us some kind of money, but I don't know how they calculate this kind of contribution, economical contribution. But it's not my capacity, and I don't think that in terms of public diplomacy, it's not this kind of the creation of the economic gains is so important. I don't think so.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong. For our next question, I think this is directed to both Dr. Ayhan and Dr. Hong. So this is actually regarding inter-Korean relations. So our participant is asking is on the short and long-term social, political, and cultural impact of South Korean pop culture on North Korea. Do you think K-pop will have a role in the future environment of the Korean Peninsula? So let's start first with Dr. Ayhan on your thoughts on this.
I mean, if I actually wrote a chapter on this topic, we interviewed South Korean activists or North Korean defector turned South Korean activists who sent these promotion materials with K-pop or other brochures and other promotional materials to North Korea. And if you ask them, is it effective? They say, yes, it's definitely effective. It's worth doing. And if you ask how they evaluate their work, and they say, look how desperate North Korea is to stop what we are doing. If we were ineffective, they wouldn't care. But this is effective. And indeed, in recent, I mean, I partially agree with them. But if we especially look at the recent news reports, Kim Jong-un's emphasis on encouraging or discouraging, rather, North Korean youth not to watch these materials or follow South Korean fashion and so on, we might think, yes, probably it is a window for them out to open up to outside. And North Korea is very much strictly controlling information coming into the country. So K-pop is a very natural platform, a window opening up the country. But again, we should not exaggerate its influence. I mean, if people are wondering if, I mean, you watch enough K-pop stars, would there be a revolution if enough people watch it? I don't think so. I mean, we shouldn't exaggerate the influence of popular culture. It would be similar to exposure to Hollywood during the Cold War in communist countries. Did it have any influence? It definitely did, but we shouldn't exaggerate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayhan. Dr. Hong, your thoughts on this?
Oh yeah. Now I interviewed the North Koreans in who evaded North Korea and who lived in South Korea in 1998. You know, even at the time, already the North Korean youth hear South Korean music and television regarding the South Korean youths demonstrate in the street. They understood that they are bigger than those Korean youth, and they are well, you know, the very good clothes and etc. So they consume South Korean information, especially culture products. But as Dr. Ayhan said, we cannot imagine that the influence is something explosive. But we can assume that it is the case that between two Beverly and at the end of the 80s, that the influence exists, and it will be very gradual and ideological stakes. So yeah, I agree with Dr. Ayhan on that point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong. Okay, for our next question, I think this would be best answered by Dr. Asor. So this is from JC Crisostomo. In cultural diplomacy, is there any possible harm on the host country's cultural identity while in the process of cultural exchange? So for in this case, is there any consequences on Filipino culture if we continue to embrace Korean culture? What do you think, Dr. Asor?
Just like what Dr. Ayhan mentioned, that we should not also think of the Korean, the Hallyu and Korean wave in a very exaggerated way, like the influence of it in shaping our imaginary. There is an influence, yes, I agree, in shaping the imaginary. For example, imaginary of desire, imaginary of going to different places. I'm a migration scholar, and one of my respondents would say that one of her reasons for going to Korea was because she was so into the Winter Sonata, and then it was followed by different dramas and whatnot. So it was part of the imaginary, and we call it migration imaginary, that could shape our, imaginary of going somewhere and our desire to go somewhere. However, there are, just like in sociology, there are life chances and there are life choices. No matter how much we want to go somewhere or do something, there are still the contextual constraints around us, external forces that may not allow us to do that. So it will not affect it totally, although just like Dr. Hong's presentation, the SB 19 became very popular and successful in the Philippines, and they were trained in South Korea. But I would not say that it would change the imaginary and some kind of cultural influences among us Filipinos. We are still consumers of various cultural products. Netflix, we still have the Hollywood influence is still very strong. Some of the younger people are consumers of Japanese cultural products. So I think it's part of the hybridization, right? It is a combination of what is maybe considered to be Filipino, no matter how debatable that Filipino culture is, but it is also a combination of what we relate to and our desires and imaginary as an individual or as people.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asor. Okay, so we have another question. Let's see, from Ms. Rain Evangelista. How is the field of public diplomacy affected by fandom mobilization, like in the case of BTS and ARMY? Given that the fandom has members from all walks of life and from different countries, how do BTS and ARMY still contribute to the public diplomacy and nation branding of Korea? Dr. Hong, would you like to try answering this?
How they contribute for public diplomacy of Korea? I think that I'd like to transform the question. Is the people who ARMY, for example, have a better idea of Korea because they love BTS? Something like that, you know. I think so. I I definitely did say so because it doesn't mean that they love Korea without condition. Our armies, as a fan, are very, very active, engaged public. So I saw so many times that they discuss on social thing and in Korea, social disparities, for example, in Korea, and economic problems in Korea. They know all about that. So they discuss this, criticize it sometimes, but it means that they relate more and more with the Korean society, history, and culture. So it means this kind of will produce some kind of engagement, sentimental engagement with Korea. So I think that their effect, public diplomacy, BTS have a very positive effect for public diplomacy of Korea, of course.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hong. How about you, Dr. Ayhan? Do you have any thoughts on this, since it mentioned about the contribution of fans to the development of South Korea's public diplomacy, and given that it's already becoming a bottom-up approach and it's led by citizens? What do you think about this?
I don't want to add anything to what Dr. Hong already said. I agree.
Okay, thank you very much. So since we still have more time, I think we have one participant who would like to raise a question by speaking directly through the microphone. I think the participant is raising his hand, so we would like to invite that participant to introduce himself or herself, and you may speak directly to our speaker.
Okay, I'm Nanswa from Indonesia. My question is, how much influence K-drama and K-pop have on fans' interest in continuing education in Korea?
If I may go first, as I said, I did research on Global Korea Scholarship, and we asked, and this is different than all international students. So different international students might have different justifications or reasons to come to Korea. As for Global Korea Scholarship students, we asked them, for example, their main source of information about Korea. For most of them, it was Korean popular culture, followed by Korean news stories about Korea. But when we asked them why they chose to come to Korea, Korean Wave was one of the least important reasons. So it's mostly functional and instrumental. Probably it would be higher for language students. Probably it would be higher for self-funded students, but it's definitely among the least important reasons for scholarship students. They chose Korea mainly because Korea has good universities, good quality of education, and also I cannot remember the exact answers right now out of my head, but mostly instrumental reasons that would help them with upward mobility.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayhan. Would the other speakers like to answer this as well?
If I may.
Sure, Dr. Asor, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm also working on a research project on the role of brokers, the returnees, Filipino returnees with higher educational degrees from South Korean universities. And based on my initial findings, Korean wave or Korean pop culture, they did not mention it as one of their reasons or main reasons in studying in South Korea. It's mostly either, a kind of hub. When I say hub, it's either a person or it's either an organization that they heard the information about South Korean education. And perhaps it's also the network and also the ties that their Philippine universities or Philippine organization have with South Korean professors, South Korean scholars, or South Korean universities. And it could be based on more formal institutions like memorandum of agreement between two organizations and two higher education agencies, but least of the, it may have influenced them. They may like Korean food. They may be consumers of Korean cultural products such as Korean music and Korean drama. However, as I mentioned again, there is this very interesting dynamics between life chances and life choices. Like I may want to study in Seoul Daehakgyo or Seoul National University, but I may have not passed their requirements or my merit does not reach their requirements, and I have to go to another university, let's say, that because I did not pass the requirements. So we sociologists are very much aware of these life chances and life choices. We may like it, but we still require other external factors such as networks, such as our own merit. But of course, Korean institutions such as Korean foundations and Korean universities have been more proactive these days, especially like, for example, in the University of the Philippines, Diliman, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there were only about 50 students who went for exchange students. But I think before the pandemic, there were about hundreds of students who went for student exchange programs to South Korea. So that is part of the life chances and the life choices being, in parallel and in adherence with each other. But most of the time, it is about where the information may come from, and it is usually mediated and brokered by either individuals or organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Asor. Dr. Hong, would you like to add more?
Oh, no. I think that the Dr. Asor's explanation is very well and explain almost the phenomenon. And just like to add that the number of students who want to learn Korean augmented sensitively in last 10 years. And the main reason of this desire is from the popularity of Korean culture. So yeah, perhaps it's one of the conditions that the augmentation of the exchange students between Korea and other foreign countries, but not the reason of this augmentation. Yeah, of course.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hong. In the interest of time, we have one last question. So the question is, to what extent is the use of cultural diplomacy would be relevant on South Korea's relations towards other countries? Dr. Ayhan, would you like to answer this one?
I think we have already talked about this. Actually, there is another question that we didn't address. Sharp power by Eduardo Menes.
Okay.
I can answer that if you want.
Okay, sure.
So it asks the potential of okay. I'm not sure if I understood the question right. So my suggestion for Hallyu to be a conversation starter was definitely not making Korean artists propagating for the government. It's definitely not that. Indeed, the government should be the least involved in their work. The government, some authoritarian governments, for example, make directors shoot certain movies to promote their political agenda. And you may guess which countries do it the most. I'm not definitely suggesting that there should be films or there should be music or they would be making speeches on behalf of the government to promote government policies, domestic or foreign. I'm definitely not suggesting this. I'm suggesting Hallyu as a conversation starter only to the extent that there are people interested in Korea because of their interest in Korean pop culture, as Dr. Hong also previously mentioned, also Dr. Asor previously mentioned, more people learning Korean language, for example. So my suggestion was making it move to the next stage. Korean language is another stage, so it's one stage. Being in conversation, engaging these fans, listening to them, and trying to satisfy their needs and demands. So opening up, for example, more language schools is satisfying that demand. That's one thing. Another thing would be, for example, they would probably want to have more interactions with Korean people because they already have interactions with Koreans through this medium of pop culture. But it's not interactive, right? They just listen to music, they just watch films and dramas, but they want to have more human-to-human interactions. So if embassies find out what they are interested in, what topics they're interested in, they would be in a position to organize such events where they have interactions with their South Korean counterparts. So that's what I was talking about in terms of Hallyu being a conversation starter, engaging those people who are interested in Hallyu.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ayhan, for your response to Assistant Secretary Nunez. And with that, we formally conclude the open forum for today's event. So thank you very much, everyone, for your active participation. And before we conclude, Dr. Ayhan said that he wanted to see everyone in the Zoom meeting room. So we would like to invite everyone once again to turn on the camera for a take two on the photo opportunity. I think we have already fixed the Zoom settings so that everyone can turn on their cameras. Can everyone try turning on their cameras right now?
Actually, I would have preferred it while presenting.
Okay, may we see if everyone can turn on their camera?
Probably not.
Okay, I think we're experiencing a bit of technical difficulty. Let's see. Okay, so. Okay, so I see it's still disabled. Okay. Okay, it's okay. We'll just proceed with a few more reminders to see if we will be able to fix it. So before exiting the webinar, we would like to request our participants to kindly accomplish our online client satisfaction survey, which you can access by clicking the link posted in the chat box. The QR code of the survey will be flashed on your screen shortly. Once again, we would like to remind everyone that accomplishing the survey is a requirement for those who wish to receive a certificate of participation. For our participants, you may also visit UPKRC's YouTube channel later to access the recording of today's webinar. Okay, I think we got a go signal from our technical team, so I can see everyone's cameras are already open. Thank you very much for your patience. Okay, so let's do a take two of our photo op. And with this, I hope it's okay if we can do the finger heart as we tried a while ago, since we just celebrated K-pop. We just discussed K-pop. Okay, our technical team is ready to take the screenshot. Let's do it in 2 batches. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, one last. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much, guys, for your active participation and for your patience. And with that, thank you very much to our speakers and participants for joining us today in this online edition of the Mabini Dialogue series. We hope to see you again in our future events. Thank you very much and have a safe and happy weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.